Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing what the San Jose Barracuda lineup could look like for the beginning of the upcoming 25-26 season. We spent a lot of time over the last month and a half discussing what the San Jose Sharks lineup could look like with the additions of players like Jeff Skinner and John Klingberg and Philip Kurashev, but I've gotten some questions about where do the Sharks' top prospects fit into all of this. Well, that's where the San Jose Barracuda do come in. The Sharks have had a lot of draft picks over these last few seasons, and they're finally beginning to filter in to the AHL. Players like Chernyshov, Musty, and Haltinen now under that San Jose umbrella, looking to make their full-time North American professional debuts, which is what's going to make the Barracuda a very interesting and exciting team to watch going in to this next season. Now, there is one thing that does need to be mentioned before discussing this lineup, which is that a few of these players are not actually waiver exempt. Guys like Colin White and Lucas Carlson, and this is important to mention because it means that theoretically one or more of them could end up being picked up by a different NHL team, and thus they would not be able to play with the San Jose Barracuda, obviously. However, it is extremely unlikely that this does occur because those players would then have to remain in the NHL, and I wouldn't say that any of these players are necessarily NHL caliber, at least for one of the 31 other NHL teams. So it is a very low likelihood of occurring, but does bear mentioning anyway. When it comes to the first line, we have Colin White as that number one center. It is a general rule of thumb that I kept for the top three lines here that I wanted to have one veteran presence to balance out the extremely youthful lineup that the Barracuda are likely and will end up having. So I have Colin White centering both Cam Lund and Igor Chernyshov. We saw White jump into this first line center position during the playoffs for the San Jose Barracuda this past season because of the injury to Andrew Podorowski. He has a decent amount of NHL experience, he has a good amount of AHL experience, and so he could be a pretty good player here for this particular role. Some people might want to play a player like Philip Bystedt into this position, and this is also a good time to mention that these top three lines are extremely fluid. A lot can change. Nobody's name is really set in stone. This is in stark contrast to the Sharks roster in the NHL, where players like Celebrini, he's going to definitely be the number one center. Eklund and Toffoli are obviously going to be in the top six. Will Smith as well as that second line center. There's not going to be a lot of movement with those particular players, but in the AHL, these players could find themselves on the top line. The next game, they could be on the second and then the third line. A lot can shift as time goes on here, but I have White being that number one center at least to begin the year. Cam Lund will be on the wing, and it is hopeful that he will be able to go through the Colin Graf style of development path. Graf, a couple of years ago, made his NHL debut at the end of the 23-24 season after signing a contract out of the NCAA, played a few games there, began the 24-25 season in the AHL with the Barracuda, put up some really great numbers, made the jump to the NHL at around the halfway mark, and hopefully is not going to look back from there. Lund, we saw at the end of this past season, also played a handful of games, looked okay, and is now going to be starting this season with the Barracuda. He won't have the same benefits that Graf had. Graf got to play with Podorowski, who was the most offensively prolific player in the entire AHL. Colin White does not have those same type of credentials, so it's not going to be as easy as an opportunity as Graf did have, but hopefully Lund can still make some pretty good progress, and at the very least he will have an extremely skilled winger on the other side with Igor Chernyshov, likely the Barracuda's best prospect on this entire roster. A very high ceiling for this particular player. In fact, I thought he might actually be able to play in the NHL for this upcoming season, but with the addition of Jeff Skinner, as well as the likelihood that Michael Misa starts the year in the NHL, I don't know if there is a position for him on that NHL roster. So instead, he'll be with the Barracuda. He'll be given some big minutes. We saw him dominate in the OHL this past season. We also saw him have, in a very brief stint with the Barracuda, some really solid moments. He scored a goal for the Barracuda in a playoff game this past season. And on top of all of this, he has already had some experience in a professional league, having played a handful of games, in fact, a large handful of games in the KHL during his draft year. So I expect some pretty big numbers from Chernyshov this season. When it comes to the second line, this is where you have Philip Bystedt. This is a pretty important year for Bystedt. Yes, he is a late first rounder, but a first rounder nonetheless, and this is now going to be his draft +4 season. This is usually, especially for forwards, where you want to see a guy really making a case to be able to make it into the NHL, but with the roster that the Sharks currently have, probably not going to be the case here. So for Bjorkstrand, you want to be able to put up a season where next year the Sharks cannot possibly deny him a roster spot. This past year, it was rather inconsistent. He had some great games, some not so great games. That carried into the playoffs for the Barracuda, where again, extremely hit or miss. Now it's about going to be ironing out a lot of the problems in his game and try to be a lot more consistently solid for this team. And he's going to be playing with some very solid players here, flanked in particular by Quentin Musty, another top prospect within the San Jose Sharks organization. The thing about Musty is that while this is definitely not a make or break year, it is still a very important season for him, because the only way to describe last year for Musty is a setback. It was a series of unfortunate events. Beginning of the year, he decides to sit out games while he's trying to request a trade from Sudbury. It doesn't end up working. He returns, plays a few games, get injured, doesn't get to play at the World Juniors, comes back, plays a few more games, moves into the playoffs, and then gets swept out of the first round. It just didn't really feel as though he made a lot of progress in his game. So definitely a bit of a step back for him in general. Still viewed as a very high potential player here, but it's about showcasing that at this now professional level. We saw him put together a very solid playoff game with the Barracuda at the end of this past season. Can he do that on a more consistent basis? Now is the question. He'll likely be given a good opportunity for it. On the other side, we then do have the one veteran of this line, Pavel Regenda. He was perhaps the Barracuda's best forward during their playoff run this past season, which did earn him a new contract with the organization this offseason. And so hopefully his more kind of aggressive, go-to-the-net type of play style, along with Bjorkstrand being more of that two-way guy, will help Quentin Musty try to get some of those aspects into his game, because we know that the high potential is there. But you want to see him be able to be more of that kind of aggressive, grindy, maybe power forward type of player with the size that he does bring to the table. When it comes now to the third line, again, a lot of fluidity here. Even this third line is actually looking quite solid, where the center we have is Patrick Giles. This was a player that a couple of months ago I had as a consideration for a potential NHL spot with the San Jose Sharks. It is likely that that ship has sailed with the additions that San Jose has made, but Giles is still a very solid player, especially in the AHL, and so I do expect some pretty good things from him. On one side, we do have Ethan Cardwell. I have talked about in the past how this is a very important season for Cardwell going into this next year because of the fact that it is a contract season, and we have seen Mike Greer get rid of a few prospects that have been drafted by Doug Wilson, like Bordelot and Gushin just recently, and Cardwell is a Doug Wilson draft pick, so we'll see what ends up happening there. Even if he does find himself on this third line, it is still a pretty good position to actually be able to put up some points, and I imagine again that he'll be able to work his way up in the lineup, especially if he is doing well. And both of these players will end up being very good to be playing next to Kasper Halttunen. Halttunen, we know the big asset that he has as a player is his shot. It is already at a pretty close to elite level at this point, but that's one of the major and only aspects that he is actually currently bringing to the table. Everywhere else he is sort of lacking, at least from an NHL perspective, but playing him with a player like Giles, who has that type of big body style, who can play more physically and be more involved, and Cardwell, who is a little bit smaller, obviously, but plays a bigger game, will help Halttunen get those aspects, like with Quentin Musty, to be more of a nuisance on the ice, be more of a physical presence, get into people's faces, work harder along the boards, so that he's not just a one-trick pony, one-timer on the power play type of guy, but actually someone who a team can actually justify playing in, let's say, a third-line role in the NHL, so he can actually get a chance of getting some power play ice time. When it comes then to the Barracuda's fourth line here, this is where we have a couple of interesting players still. The first and big one here is Igor Afanasyev on the wing. So his story is a little bit strange because a year ago, the Sharks acquired him in the Ozzy Weisblatt trade. But the big thing for Afanasyev is that he wanted to go to a team where he would have an opportunity to play in the NHL, and the Sharks weren't willing to offer him that. And so as such, he decided to go play a year in the KHL. But after that didn't maybe go as well as he was hoping for, he has now come back to North America and signed a contract with the Sharks, but it seems even less likely this year that he'll be able to get an NHL spot, which means he's probably going to be spending some time with the Barracuda. But as I mentioned earlier on, you kind of want to be able to put your young players into a position to succeed here. So guys like Chernyshov and Musty and Halttunen and these players will be given priority most likely in the lineup, which means it's hard to really find a spot for Afanasyev in that top 6 or even in that top 9, despite the fact that a couple of years ago with the Milwaukee Admirals, he was was close to a point per game player. So I imagine he will get some ice time. He will be in the starting 12. It's just hard to guess exactly where he does end up playing. On the other side here, we have Oskar Alosin, who was the acquisition in the Danil Gushchin trade from the Colorado Avalanche organization. He's still a former first rounder. He is still relatively young on his ELC, and so I suspect that the Barracuda will want to integrate him into the lineup, but I'm not necessarily expecting huge things from him. And then when it comes to the center on this line, this was the player who the Barracuda had centering their fourth line throughout much of this past season, Van Roboys. And because the Barracuda didn't necessarily get so many better options into this particular position, and they do prefer this player who plays at more grindy style, he, I suspect, will be a fourth line option for them for sure in this role. The next group of players to talk about are other forwards who could end up getting a roster spot here depending on how things do play out. The first of which is Zach Ostapchuk. Now, this is someone who maybe a couple of months ago or a month ago I thought would be more of an NHL player for the Sharks, that Mike Grier would want to have him in the lineup because of the fact that he had acquired him in that Fabian Zetterlund trade, and you don't really want to give up on a player who was clearly a very important piece of that particular trade. However, with the potential that Michael Misa ends up starting the year in the NHL, it's hard to imagine that Ostapchuk is able to get a top 12 spot, and because of the fact that he is still waiver exempt, that makes him a pretty easy demotion to the San Jose Barracuda. And unlike a player like Colin Graf, who I have talked about how you don't really want him taking a step backwards in his development, he already showcased some good things in 33 NHL games, and you want that to now continue on a more full-time basis. For a player like Ostapchuk, despite having played more games than Graf in the NHL, in fact 56, I believe, across both the Sharks and the Ottawa Senators, he hasn't done nearly as much to actually prove himself as a solid NHL player. He just has been extremely unremarkable. It's not as though that he was terrible with the Sharks. He just didn't actually do much of anything. And so it doesn't even feel like that much of a step back with him actually getting sent down to the San Jose Barracuda. But I don't have him in the lineup because I don't know if it's a guarantee that this will end up occurring. But if he does end up in the AHL, I imagine he'll find his way into the lineup almost certainly above a player like Van Roboys. The next player is Shane Bowers. He was the acquisition in the Thomas Bordelot trade, but there really isn't much special with this particular player. He'll likely be like a 13th, 14th forward that pops into the lineup if certain players get injured or if certain players get called up due to injuries on the San Jose Sharks. So I imagine he'll get a few games here or there, but definitely not a priority to insert into the lineup. Next, we have Anthony Vincent and Donovan Houle. These are two players that are kind of similar to Van Roboys, where there's the fourth line grinder type of guys. They had some pretty important roles for the Barracuda this past season as like an identity line on their fourth line, along with Scott Sabrin, who is no longer with the organization. But with the influx of talent that have now come to the San Jose Barracuda, it's hard to really view them as getting consistent roster spots. They'll play here or there, as I mentioned, with injuries or call-ups occurring, but not really guys who you're prioritizing for a top 12. And then there's a couple of signings that the Sharks actually made this offseason with Huntington and LaBerge. They could potentially insert into the lineup. LaBerge is more of in that kind of grindy style fourth liner role, so not really a priority. Huntington has put up some pretty good numbers in the past in the AHL, but in particular for this previous season, the 2024-25 year, he only played 4 games due to significant injuries. And so actually getting back up to speed here, it's still a pretty big question mark. But again, they'll probably factor in some way. On the defensive side of things, this is where the Barracuda are slightly lacking. They got a ton of forward help with the additions of Chernyshov and Musty and Halttunen and Lund, but it is only really Matthias Havlid who is coming over as a bigger name San Jose Sharks prospect, and even he is not exactly at the top levels of the Sharks prospect pool. It is really going to be next year where the Barracuda start to get a lot more defensive help. This year, however, they will have to make do with what they have. Now, as the number one defenseman on this team, that will likely end up being Luca Cagnoni. We saw him take up this role for the Barracuda in these past year's playoffs, where he was playing a very important position on that top pairing. And this is going to be an interesting year to watch Cagnoni. We saw him put up some fantastic offensive numbers, but when it came to his actual even strength play, it wasn't necessarily amazing. It was quite good for a young rookie talent like he was, but it wasn't exactly like, oh, this is a player who's clearly NHL ready. But we did get to see him play a few NHL games at the end of this past season. He looked all right there, and hopefully he's able to use that experience to really move into this top pairing role for the San Jose Barracuda. Now, in the playoffs this past season, he did get to play with Jimmy Schultz, and Schultz, while being on his offside, was still a very solid defenseman who was able to back up Cagnoni rather well from a defensive standpoint. This year, they do not actually necessarily have this type of player. I guess the hope here, and this is the reason I'm playing with this player, is that a player like Cole Clayton will be able to fit into that position. He is a right-handed defenseman, which is nice. He was actually an assistant captain with the Columbus AHL team this past season, and so perhaps he could be a player who ends up playing with Cagnoni. There was the option of someone like Lucas Carlsson filling into this spot because he's more of that veteran guy, but Carlsson would have to play as offside, and Carlsson is also more of an offensive guy like Cagnoni is, and so perhaps Clayton could be the better fit, but I imagine this is not locked in any which way. There will probably be a few trials of players in this particular position, but maybe Clayton will get that first attempt. When it comes to the second pairing, this is where I do have Lucas Carlsson, and I have him playing with Matthias Havlid. Having Havlid, even though you want to put like a younger guy into a position to succeed, having him play with Cagnoni, those are two undersized defensemen, not exactly the correct move. And so Havlid, that right side guy, get him with a veteran like Lucas Carlsson. They're both Swedish as well, so perhaps that will help out. And we'll see if Havlid can make some good progress. This is a second-round pick of the San Jose Sharks from back in 2022. And for a more undersized defenseman, you're usually expecting some pretty big numbers like we have seen from Cagnoni at pretty much every single level. And that hasn't quite been the case for Havlid. So this is going to be an interesting year to see if he can actually really showcase himself at the North American level, where this is really where you're going to end up making or breaking a potential NHL career. And then when it comes to the Barracuda's third pairing, this is where we have Jake Furlong, who is a work in progress when it comes to a defensive prospect, also a 2022 draft pick, but back in the 5th round. So you're definitely willing, especially as a defenseman, to give him the extra couple of years of development time. He played a good chunk of the season this past year with the San Jose Barracuda. That is likely to continue, and hopefully he can hold down a solid third pairing role. And then I have him playing with Noah Beck. The Barracuda are very clearly lacking on the right side here defensively, and so Beck is having to play on his offside. Hopefully he can handle that assignment. Now you'll notice that one player is very obviously missing from this setup here, and that is of course Jack Thompson. I mentioned earlier on how there are a few players that will have to pass through waivers but are likely to make it through, and so I can include them in this lineup. Jack Thompson is the one questionable player, however. He is likely at best the 8th or maybe 9th defenseman on the Sharks NHL roster, and so unless the Sharks are willing to put a player like Vincent Desharnais on waivers and then keep Thompson as like the 8th defenseman on the roster, it is very likely he is attempted to be sent down, but he is no longer waivers exempt, and so one of 31 other NHL teams will have the opportunity to pick him up. And honestly, a young right-handed defenseman with some NHL experience, it would be a pretty attractive option for teams like Pittsburgh or Boston or Philadelphia, teams near the bottom of the standings who maybe don't necessarily have the most competitive of rosters, who could take a chance on a player like Thompson on the cheap, give him an NHL spot as a 6th or 7th defenseman. And so I wouldn't be surprised if he actually isn't able to be playing with the San Jose Barracuda this next season. If he does get sent down, if he does clear waivers and this is where he finds himself, he is definitely the extremely obvious choice to be playing with Cagnoni on that top pairing, but we'll see what ends up happening. And then the one other player to mention here is Brandon Hache. We saw him get some games with the Barracuda this past season. He even participated in the playoffs for them. And he is a player who I actually kind of do like as a 7th defensive option here. So I imagine he'll get a few games here or there, but maybe not immediately in that starting top 6. It should also be noted at this point that there are other players who could end up, it's not as though the Barracuda literally only have 7 defensemen if we don't include Jack Thompson in that. There are guys, for instance, with the Wichita Thunder in the ECHL who could end up getting called up, but these are really the main name players for the Barracuda that they are likely to use, and maybe a few other guys will get a handful of games here or there. On the goaltending side of things, as you would expect, it is going to be Gabe Carrier, probably as the starter. But what is very interesting is that the Barracuda had the opportunity of also signing Georgi Romanov, giving him at least a qualifying offer, trying to keep him as a restricted free agent so that the Barracuda could run with Carrier and Romanov as their tandem. But instead, they actually let him walk. And that seems to be an indication that they do have a lot of faith in Matt Davis, who is a goaltender that they signed at the end of his NCAA season with Denver University. He obviously put up some really, really great numbers there, and it seems as though the Sharks and the Barracuda are putting a good amount of faith in him to be a solid backup goaltender here for Carrier. But honestly, when it comes to the AHL, as I mentioned, you want to give these young players to succeed. It is very possible that Davis actually ends up being more than just a backup, maybe even splitting some games with Gabe Carrier, and we'll get to see what the Barracuda have with this particular player who they are clearly putting a lot of faith into. The Barracuda did at the very least pick up a kind of fallback type of goaltender here from the Islanders organization, Skarek. He had played with the Bridgeport Sound Tigers. They were a terrible team, and so his stats were extremely bad, which is why I think that the Barracuda will instead go with Carrier and Davis as their main tandem. But you want that fallback guy there, and he's someone who will maybe play a few games depending on if a call-up happens or an injury happens or whatever the case may be. But that would do it for this San Jose Barracuda lineup. As I said, it is likely going to be a very exciting team to watch. Players like Chernyshov and Musty and Haltinen and Lund all being able to get some very real good experience here at a professional level. How are they going to be able to do? What type of point totals are we going to see from them? How many of them are actually going to get some NHL games this season, especially as the year goes on? That does remain to be seen, but it is really a fun time within the organization, not just with the Sharks, but for the NHL and AHL team. Class dismissed.